Hey, everybody, welcome back to Negotiations in the News, or only Negotiations in the News. I got to get the title correct. And today we're going to talk about an update to the Iranian conflict. Is it a war? I guess it's not technically a war because Congress hasn't approved. So there's some political negotiations within the U.S. that have to take place. But it keeps going back and forth. It feels like, hey, we're getting announcements from both sides. By the way, Iran made some announcements over the weekend. And then all of a sudden we go back to shooting rockets and drones at each other and pointing fingers at the other side. Gentlemen, what's your take?
I've started in the past, so I'll let Joshua go
Okay.
first.
Sure. Well, look, I think at this point it seems like, the sticking point is this whole notion about the Strait of Hormuz and, whether there's going to be control or not of that by the Iranians going forward. It feels like they seem to have some leverage to that effect.
Sure.
And of course, the whole point of all of this, at least the articulated point from a lot of people, was the nuclear capability of Iran. And so I think there's a couple of things going on. I think those are two pieces that seem to be sort of stalled and stuck. But I think there's another element to this that's complicating everything dramatically, which is the fighting between the Israelis and Hezbollah. Because it's all tied together. And I think that there's a sense the Iranians keep going back to that notion that, look, we're not going to agree to anything while fighting continues there,
Right.
et cetera. And so it feels like everybody is seeking to exercise their leverage in different ways here, and it doesn't seem like it's getting anybody very far.
Would- Okay, so where do the Abraham Accords factor in? We've got the Sunni Shia divide, and you've got a lot of the Muslim population, well, that part of the world wants a peaceful solution, wants a secure region. Um, and yet we have the small, what's 15% are Shia, right?
Mhm.
Splintered off, uh, really, you know, going to die on the hill, quite literally in some cases.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Abraham Accords, if you think about like what was the utility of the Abraham Accords, from my point of view, it was primarily psychological. There had not been Arab countries that had normalized relations with Israel.
Mhm.
And again, if you look at who did, they were not major players, right? So it was a psychological barrier that I think was broken. I mean, there was no fighting between them. It was really more economics and things like that. Um,
Yeah.
when Trump came out and said he mandatorily requests that all of these other countries join the Abraham Accords, it's a pretty big oxymoron to say you mandatorily request something because, right.
Okay, let
But
me opine on
yeah,
that one topic,
sure.
because I believe that the United States should have a have somebody who's been successful in a career, be it political or in business. But I think there's a very distinct difference between being successful as the CEO of a company with your name on it, where you're allowed to dictate.
Yeah,
It's my way or the highway. You're
right,
fired. I mean, he made a
right,
whole career off you're fired,
right.
right? And it's a whole different, I'm going to say, skill set, dare I say, negotiations. And it's not a business to business negotiation, but it's an interpersonal negotiation. When you've
Mhm.
got it could be a C-suite person, um, but an operator, a chief operating officer who has to get marketing and sales to work together with operations, with finance, with purchasing. To get these groups to come together internally, I think is a skill set, a negotiation. And then you don't get to dictate like Trump tried to do. You
No,
actually have to work as a coalition of people. And yes, there is leadership, and yes, sometimes you have to be heavy-handed. I get it, but that's more the exception than the rule. That's what I'd like to see out of politicians is somebody who actually knows how to accomplish something, not just have a title, and do it as a collective working together. I see a lack of that globally.
Well, on the Abraham's Accord, well, I think you're right, Mike. But on the Abraham Accord, I think it's particularly difficult, and if I may be wrong, but the Saudis, I believe, are saying, and maybe the Pakistanis, that we're not going to agree or join the Abraham Accords until or unless there's a Palestinian state. And Israel
Yeah.
is, dead set against that. And how somebody can negotiate, that situation, I think is going to require the wisdom of Solomon. And I hope there is somebody who can, figure out how to break that deadlock. But boy, I see that as a real challenge. But I'm all for the Abraham Accords. I hope they win, or I mean, I hope that all comes together. But I
Yeah.
just see this as a really big challenge.
Well,
Well,
is it the long game? You know, it if you
it
if
is the long game. And
yeah.
sorry, Mike, I was just going to
Come on.
say the one small amendment, Gerry, which is the language that people have been using and talking about is a path to a Palestinian state, which is different than, having a Palestinian state declared at the end of something. Because right now, the Israelis are going to resist that to the end of time, a Palestinian state. But a path is different. And it also, in my mind, requires that other countries like Saudi Arabia and Egypt, and maybe Jordan play a guarantor kind of role. Like, to me, that's what I think goes along with all of this, is that um, it's that, and I sense that there may be some willingness on the part of those countries to do that if there was agreement, that they're on the road to that. I believe that, the Palestinians are probably going to have some form of technocratic government,
Mhm.
as a transitional piece, which has been talked about as part of all of this and has been talked about for a while, actually. But a 5-year window that says, hey, we're going to put in place the notion of governance here and, like, attempt to get to a functioning state so that there's enough confidence on the part of all of the parties that
Right.
this can actually happen and happen differently.
Right. Well, I'm going to throw out there could be a trap. Um, if Israel came to the table and said, you know what, we're going to give Palestine, we're going to give you your state everywhere you are, right where the borders are right now, that's going to be yours. We're going to go to the UN. We're going to get you approved. You are going to be a country. Aren't yay us. We're going to help you.
Mhm.
We've seen the wrongs that we've done because right now they have a PR mess where they're the bully on beating up on an
Yep.
occupied territory.
Yep.
But if they
Yeah.
go and they get and now long term, I don't think the Palestinians will be able to help themselves. And again, this goes 5,000 years of rock throwing and name calling. And once they become a state, then you can go to war. All Israel has to do is sit back and wait for Palestine to raise an army. And then when you are attacked by a country, you can then go to real war, not an occupational war, and you can win the war and take the land back. Is, am I out of my mind?
You're not out of your mind. I think one of the preconditions is, at least that I've heard, was that the Palestinians would not have a standing army. They would have a police force, but not a standing army, which is, obviously quite different. And I think that that's the kind of thing. Again, this is where I think the role of guarantors can be particularly important.
Well, no, wait, hold on a
Uh,
second, Josh. I got to push back because we had a
yeah.
we had a police action over in Korea and probably Vietnam, and the U.S. is famous for yeah, it's a police action, and they're, what's the definition of police?
Well, I mean, look, the Palestinians would have security to monitor their own and handle their own challenges and problems within, like any
Yeah,
other country does. A military or an army is largely about protecting externally. That's where the line is, that for a lot of people is, we don't want, at least in the near term, we don't want the Palestinians to have a military or an army that,
yeah,
but we're okay with them having a police force and a security service. I mean, similar to, with the remnants of the Oslo process, the Palestinians had a security service that for quite a while worked at different moments in collaboration with the
yeah.
Israelis, but also, governed certain areas of the West Bank and Gaza, particularly the West Bank, and it was more of a security operation. They did not have military, or they didn't have a police, army or something along those lines. So there is a distinction. One is internally focused, the other is externally.
No, but that's on paper. In practice, once you've trained somebody how to fire a weapon, how to march in a formation, how
Yeah.
to follow procedures, and whether those guys are the enemies or those guys are the enemies, either way, you've got the
Yeah.
ability to use force to accomplish something.
Well, and this is where I think this is where the guarantors come in. So,
Okay.
like when we're talking about that, like what I would have in mind, and I think what others have in mind is that would be a peacekeeping force of some kind. So that those entities, say they were Saudi, Egyptian, and Jordanian troops, um, would guarantee and manage relations between the borders between Israel and the Palestinians, because there's no trust. So it's not going to happen on their
What if the
own.
U.S. did it? What if we said we'll be your guarantor? Like with Saudis, right? We have guaranteed them militarily. We're already have a guarantee in the region to protect an Arab nation. So isn't that pretty
I
close?
I mean, it is, but I don't think the Palestinians in general would see the United States as a guarantor, given how this is all played out. I think it's got to be countries that, at least from a Palestinian point of view and an Israeli point of view, I mean, I think what goes along with this in the end, right, is an expansion of the Abraham Accords, or normalization of relations between these countries. So if it's, I mean, there's already a modicum of relations between Egypt and Israel and Jordan and Israel. But if the Saudis came along and said, look, we'll act as a guarantor, there's a path to a Palestinian state, we'll recognize Israel. That to me is the formula that could work.
Okay.
Now,
Gerry, what do you
again,
I'm,
got?
I'm
Oh,
No,
I
I was
mean,
going to ask Josh, how just because I guess
yeah,
I haven't studied it close enough. The pathway is an interesting um, approach. How serious are people taking that approach? I mean, do you see it as viable? I mean, are people taking it that seriously, where they're thinking about it and actively discussing it as a real possibility? Because it is an interesting approach. I'll say that.
yeah. I mean, listen, there have been a number of plans that have been put forth over the last year and a half, 2 years, many of which had these components. One was having a technocratic Palestinian government, not Hamas, not the Palestinian Authority, but a technocratic government made up of bureaucrats, essentially, who would govern, and prove to the Israelis that they're capable of governing and handling their own affairs and things along those lines. And I think a 5-year window is a reasonable amount of time to demonstrate yay or nay on that kind of thing. Um, I think that, again, I think the security piece of this, to me, the guarantees, I think is key, because the Israelis and the Palestinians, the trust has never been more low, right?
Yeah.
So you have to have
right.
some other entity. In the past, it would have perhaps been the UN, but I don't think the UN is very good at peacekeeping. Um, the UN ought to focus on UNICEF and UNDP, and maybe UNESCO and a few others. But they're just hamstrung. Like, peacekeeping is a difficult business, and too often, the countries that are giving them their mandate, they're hamstringing them in a way that's not productive. Like, a lot of times they can't fire back if they're fired upon. I mean, that's crazy,
Well,
right?
and there's a lot of money in war, but munitions, and
Yeah.
let's be honest, there's also power in we are being attacked, right? So as long as you're being attacked, you can get some goodwill out of it politically. We're being persecuted. So therefore, if you should feel bad for us, and we're the minority, so we need to fight harder. There's a whole lot of emotional dynamics that I think play into the war game, where it's just never going to end. You guys may know Shane Ray Martin, and he wants to get into
No,
peace
no.
tech, and he pitched it to me, and I'm like, Shane, this is all wonderful. I just don't think that AI is going to be able to draw the line on this side of the river or that side, and everyone goes, oh my God, I didn't think about doing that. And until you can make more money off peace than you can off war, there's some wins that are in your face on that.
Yeah, and I think that is the key. And I know Shane well, and Brian Abrams, who's another friend who are focused on this. And I think I think it's the right way to go. I think it's a really good place to focus because, people are using tech for lots of purposes. There's no reason it shouldn't be used to try to, advance peaceful coexistence and things like that. I think to
Yeah.
your point, Mike, the question is, what's the incentive, right? And it may be that, for example, there are businesses that are willing to invest in technology because look, who loses in war, right? There are some businesses that gain, but there are a lot of businesses that lose out, right? Because they can't do business anymore. And
Right.
so those kind of companies can invest and could have an incentive structure that would make sense for them, right?
Right.
Um, and so I
But you
think
can always find someone that's peaceful. You can go to our wonderful friends up in Canada, right? I call them our fun uncle to the north. Like if you want to make an investment in something to put your plant, there's plenty of places with peace around the world for you to do it. So you don't need to invest in peace somewhere where there's conflict. You just go somewhere else where there's peace.
Yeah,
It,
I
it's
mean, I think it comes down to the notion of can you use, I mean, the technology that exists today, right, is transforming everything, right? And it's clearly transforming war when we see drones everywhere and, and the high-tech nature of warfare. I think it's a smart notion to be thinking, how could these be used for more peaceful purposes?
yeah,
And that might be a difficult sell, until you can figure out what that incentive structure looks like and things along those lines. To me, it's absolutely worth exploring and trying to use the power of technology. I think those of us in this world, right, like we have to get as adept at thinking strategically about how to do this as people on the other side who are utilizing, the military and defense, et cetera, for these purposes.
yeah, yeah. Again, it's a wonderful aspiration. There's a lot of and I hate people who just poo-poo ideas. We had this guy in a team that I worked on, and he just had a problem for every solution. And I went to my boss and I said, "We got to get Don out of here." And he goes,
Yeah.
"No, no, I love Don." I said, "No, I like Don as a person, but he's just a naysayer. He got no like positive momentum." And he said, "No, no, Don is our Simon. We Don finds where all the problems are, so that when we roll out programs and processes, we're already aware that there's going to be a problem because Don has told us that." So he said he called him the Simon. It's just like on American Idol when it first came out. Paul was yay, and Randy, was fairly, accurate. And then Simon was just an ass,
Mhm.
but he was
Right.
right. And if you listen to Simon, you'd be really successful.
Mhm.
So there is some of that I think goes on.
Yeah.
That we need to identify these problems and then we can fix them. If you don't know where they are, then you can't fix it.
I do think, I mean, going back to what we were talking about, to me, I think the only way really out of this is a regional solution where you're bringing in some of these other parties. Because there are a lot of parties here who now, when this all began, there was a clear stake in it, but there's even more of a stake now, I think, for the Gulf countries and others, a direct stake, that they have been now put on the front lines of all of this. And so, I mean, if it was me, that's where I would be trying to put the
Yeah.
pieces together because I think bilaterally, or, there's a number of bilateral things going on here. And I think, again, we talked about this the first time, and I'm going to say it again. The fact that Israel is not at the table with the United States and Iran is a huge problem, and it is
Mhm.
manifesting itself in that way because
But
the
once you
Israelis are
once you include
doing,
multi-parties, then Iran says, "Well, we want," and then everybody all of a sudden becomes a 5, 6 player stake.
yep.
You know,
And it's a process question, but I think, you know, I've certainly learned over the years if you leave people out of a process
yeah.
that ought to be there, right? It's not going to end well. And I think that's part of the
It's
challenge
the
that we're seeing.
Vietnam. Jerry,
Yeah.
you did that piece on Vietnam, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Uh,
Yep. Yep.
Yeah, everybody's got to have and then where do they sit at the table, and who gets
Right.
to talk and the agenda?
Yeah. Yeah.
Are the
But the other thing
Saudis?
is if you don't do that, then you're likely to agree to something that isn't going to be acceptable to the Israelis,
Well,
right?
I
So
would
it's like
argue
what
all this stuff, just like this. How many times has there been announced a peace, and then the very next day or the same day there
yeah,
has been, shots fired? Like who's not getting the memo that there is peace here? We have a ceasefire, which has never held up.
right. And I
So
think
Well,
but I think the parties can say Well, we weren't at the table. We didn't agree to a ceasefire, so why are we being held to that standard?
Yeah,
That's
but
the
even in
problem,
the most recent,
right?
like the Iranian military, whatever's left, supposedly fired at a U.S. military installation. So, but both countries agreed there's a ceasefire, and yet there's not a ceasefire. We haven't ceased.
Mhm.
Are the
Well,
Saudis strong enough as a player to like make things happen?
Gerry,
I
you
don't
want to take
know.
that one?
I honestly don't know. I haven't seen anything that tells me that they are. Physically, or may have the capability to be to be that, but they certainly, I don't know, haven't taken what I see as a terribly, active or leadership role in this. Although they've been attacked by Iran, you would think they might have more of a leadership role, and maybe they're doing things behind the scenes I'm unaware of, which is very possible. But I've just not heard a lot out of Saudi Arabia
Yeah,
about all of this.
Well, I mean, the deal between the Saudis and the Americans for a very long time was the United States is going to help protect you and we're going to gain economically. And that's still the deal. So look, there are a couple of key players here. I mean, Iran is obviously has been a key player in the region for a long time, and so is Saudi. Saudi is huge. If the Abraham Accords had included Saudi, it would have been a wholly different ballgame, but it
I
didn't.
agree to that. Yes,
yeah,
And
yes,
that's
yeah.
why when you talk to folks about like what was the true impact of the Abraham Accords, again, for me, it was a psychological one. It broke a barrier, right? But I think if you wanted to see a dramatic shift, you really needed the much bigger entities in the region to get involved. And that's Saudi, that's a more of a warm peace between Egypt and Israel than exists now. Um, but I think Saudi is a critical player here, and they have the resources to mobilize everything else as part of it. Now, they're not going to go alone, and they're not going to do it without the preconditions that we've talked about, right?
yeah.
But they absolutely have the capability, and that the relationship and how things have played out over time makes sense, and would work, I believe.
But
Let
have
me
you seen
shift it.
them do anything in this Iran conflict, Joshua, that is impactful? Maybe I missed it.
Have they done
Have
anything?
I? Yeah, yes, yeah.
Do you mean from a
Yeah,
military point of
or
view?
even non-military. I just haven't seen a lot of impactful moves from them, and
I,
I
I
may have
think
missed them.
I think they were content to let the United States take the lead. But you saw MBS about a month ago come out and say to the United States, and right before we had our previous call, and say to the United States, look, you need to finish the job one way or another,
Right.
because you're going to leave us with a mess. If you
Hmm.
just declare victory and go home, we're the ones who are going to sit here and have to deal with the aftermath. So I think they are not a public player, but they are clearly a private player, and I believe strongly that they speak Trump's language of economics.
Oh yeah.
And
Well,
and they may
economics and
well,
authoritarian. He is an
yeah,
authoritarian, and so is
right,
MBS.
correct.
He went out
Yeah,
and
yeah,
killed some journalists.
right, exactly. And I think, and Saudi has the resources to make, for example, the track toward a Palestinian state come to life. If they
Yeah,
are committed and if they believe that
yeah.
that's a viable path, like they can genuinely help to lead that effort. And so I think that's where their power comes from. It's more of a soft power. It's not a military power. They've really acquiesced that to the United States and said, look, here's the quid pro quo. You protect us and we'll continue to do lots of business with you and help you economically.
Right.
Well, I
Well,
think the
speaking of,
Arab world looks to Saudi as kind of a leader, the
Mhm.
leader, or a significant
Yeah.
leader. And if Saudi Arabia says, let's, we'll get involved with the Abraham Accords, and the rest of them, Pakistan and the rest of them, will use that if nothing else, but to cover to join in.
right.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Well, but there's the financial, and then there's the Sunni tie, where 85% are Sunni, and they kind of want to stand together. But is there a petrodollar play? I keep I keep getting these little hints that this is not just about the nukes in Iran. This has to do with the, and that's the Saudi, right? We're gonna price oil in U.S. dollars, and everybody who's fought that, Gaddafi is gone. Pretty soon, it's interesting that anybody who really stands up and fights, with the exception of Russia, China, and India, those three. Now, you make the argument that A, they're massive. B, they're on the other side of the world from the U.S., and there's a whole lot of other trade going on. They're not adversarial, with the exception of Russia. Um, but every other country that stood up has very quickly been regime changed. Uh, so is this more of an economic war than a nuclear issue?
Venezuela, for example, Mike.
But there you go.
Um, I, you know what? I think it's become an economic war. I don't think that that was the intention.
Okay.
I really do believe that Trump thought, and Netanyahu pitched him well, that this could be done fast. This could be an
Yes.
in and out, a victory. This could be a no one else had the guts to do it. I did it, and the world is a better place.
Hey,
And
we took out
that's
Saddam in the first time when he invaded Kuwait, 24 hours, the world's fourth largest army, I think at the time. We took him out in 24 hours.
Yeah.
So it's
yeah,
not
but
unprecedented.
yeah, but again, the difference is there was a massive difference, which is ground troops, and the United States, committing ground troops to Iran, would have received even more backlash than all of this,
Yeah.
because Iran is not it's not Kuwait and it isn't Iraq. Iran is a huge country, and there's all kinds of installations that are hidden, buried, etc. So, and again, we go back to the notion, this is kind of why people hadn't done this to this point, right? But I think what's happening is that there's certainly been a crippling of a lot of the military capabilities of Iran, but it is not crippled in general. They still have capability, and I think that is the problem, right? And now there's this massive economic pressure that's happening as a result of the Strait of Hormuz. I have to imagine that um, either, I'm sure they gamed this out, but I don't think they imagined it would unfold in the way that it has. I think they thought they had more leverage to nudge Iran, to push Iran away from this. And it's
I
not
think they thought
happening.
the people were going to revolt, that
Yeah.
they had them.
Probably. But again, like, did we not learn the lesson that we were going to be greeted as heroes and libertarian,
Yeah.
and helping to develop liberty in Iraq, which didn't happen, and
Right.
Afghanistan didn't happen? Like it if that was a huge part of the thinking, then we have not learned our lessons
Right.
from history.
Yeah. This is not end of World War II.
Mm-mm. No. And I mean, I've spent a lot of time in the region working there, and the notion also of democracy is it's not a concept that a lot of people in the region embrace. There are some, the Iranians, I think, would like that because they are the people of Iran are a progressive people who understand what freedom and liberty sort of looks like, right? Because they had a taste of it. But there's a lot of places um, that had been under military rule and dictatorships for a very long time that, it's a little bit like Russia, right? I think we might have talked about this before, but when the Soviet Union collapsed and it was like, okay, we're now going to be a democracy, the people struggled mightily because the government had told them, here's what you're going to do, here's your job, here's your life, here's what you're going to be paid. And freedom doesn't tell you any of that, right?
I
And so, yeah.
I saw an interaction on the internet. It was about this person preaching the benefits of communism, and the capitalist says to the communist, so what will you be in your wonderful communist heaven? He said, oh, I will be a poet and a playwright. And he says, nope, you will pick potatoes. Because you will do what the state tells you to do. Now you'll have the minimum life, and we'll all have the same minimum, which I guess is great for a floor. But for anybody who wants to do something, it can be scary to go out. I mean, the three of us right here are prime examples, right? We weren't told you're going to go do negotiations. We had to make a career. And it can be scary. There's people out there who are really well backed and marketed, and they don't know what they're talking about, and we have to pick battles.
Right.
I'm regularly online asking questions because I don't understand what someone else is saying about a topic that I find passion and I've had a reasonable amount of success at. But they're out there; they can say they're a negotiator too, and we have to battle for, or let's say we have to compete for our share of the market. And if you can't compete, or if you don't want to compete, the free market's a scary place.
I think that's exactly right. And if it's also sort of a cultural relativism piece here, right? It's what people know. This is what they grew up with. This is what their parents and their grandparents knew is, this is the life that we lead. And so a lot of people are uncomfortable with making choices like that after that's been the sort of culture that they've existed with, and so I think in one sense it's a problem, it's a challenge of all of this is how much are people really going to embrace that kind of change? I think also, I mean, if we just pause for a second and look back at the Arab Spring, right? The Arab Spring was all about people in the region saying we've had enough of this dictatorship stuff and we want freedom, right? We're getting access to the internet and we're seeing how other people live and we want to do that. The problem was in most places that you overthrew Mubarak in Egypt, right? But you didn't have a plan for how you were going to govern after that, right?
Right.
It's one thing to be an opposition group; it's another thing to be a governing coalition or a governing group, right? And when that didn't happen, what transpired? Well, even more extreme people filled the void and the vacuum, right? And we
Right.
see that in lots of places. And so the promise of the Arab Spring was dashed because there was no sort of mindset of how do we shift away from this kind of governance that we don't like to something that is an idealized notion that none of us probably fully understand how to make it happen because we didn't grow up with it and we don't know what it looks like.
Yeah.
Well, that you remind me of something that what you've just said about Egypt and other countries. You overthrow the government, and then what? There's never a plan or a solid plan. And even in commercial negotiations, I've seen this where you can come up with a great agreement, but so often the implementation of it is never part of the agreement. There's no milestones and checkpoints, and what do we do if you fail the negotiation, or if there is some of that in the contract, it's loosey goosey,
It's what
and
Josh
so
said
many.
earlier. The right people weren't in the room. If you don't have your
Yeah,
project managers, your
right.
implementation team,
Yeah.
if it's just purchasing and
Yeah.
sales and not the operators, it can fall apart really quick.
Yeah, exactly. So it's kind of permeates at not only the governmental level, but clearly at a commercial level as well, and a military one in particular.
Yeah.
I mean, if we go back to this question about what do you do now, like given where you are, right? Like, what do you do? My feeling is that I think the United States has to find a way to bring Israel into the direct conversations, because I just don't think that this is going to change otherwise, because the United States is going to pursue its own interest. Israel's pursuing its own interest, and the fighting with Hezbollah has increased dramatically in the last couple of weeks. It continues to be ratcheted up. And so Iran is going to use that and say, we're not going to agree to anything because this is part of the deal, right? In negotiation, we always talk about, well, what issues are part of a negotiation and what are not, right? And I think
Right.
the United States tried to sort of isolate this and said, no, 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 this is between you and us. And the Iranians are like, nope, sorry, like we are a protectorate of Hezbollah, and so like what happens there is part of this negotiation, and there was never clarity about that,
Right.
and I don't think there is now. And
Could
so, yeah,
could Palestine could they kind of stir it up a little bit and go to a Trump administration and say, hey Donald, that idea you had about the Riviera, the Middle Eastern Riviera over here, that's a really good idea. Boy, we got a lot of land that needs to be completely destroyed and built up, and boy, wouldn't there be some really cool Trump towers right here on the shores of the West Bank. Um, could they play into his personal ego and pull him to the Palestinian side of this multi-state country negotiation?
Uh, um, I think it's going to be very hard because Trump is so um, close with Netanyahu. And I think the other part of it is, are you talking about like a genuine Palestinian state? Because like the Riviera notion is not like that's not what Palestinians want. Like it's not. That's what the United States wants
Yeah,
for
that's what Trump
Palestinians.
wants. Yeah.
Right. But it's not what the Palestinians want. And frankly, as part of that plan, a lot of Palestinians would be permanently displaced, which is even more of what the
Because they
Palestinians
can't
don't
afford to
want.
live in those nice places.
Well, on yeah, I mean, and if you look at Gaza, I mean, Gaza has been raised. Like if you like, let's like not, pull any punches about it. I mean, it's flattened.
It's
And
yeah, the pictures.
yeah,
They're
so you're really starting from scratch. And the question is, what does this look like? And then you have, I mean, on the flip side of this in the West Bank, you have a lot of violence that's happening between settlers and Palestinians, and there's a lot of effort to kind of, to take back the West Bank through force, which is what's happening quietly and slowly. And, it's making the facts on the ground very hard to actually create a Palestinian state. There
Mhm.
was never going to be a contiguous Palestinian state because you had Gaza and then you have Israel proper and then you have the West Bank. So there was always talk of a corridor between the two in some way, shape, or form. But the facts on the ground are changing so dramatically, and I think that the right wing folks in Israel, that's the plan. Like that's the purpose of doing this. And so if you actually want to come up with a solution that might include all of this, it probably needs to happen sooner rather than later because things keep changing and moving the parties further away from that reality.
Well, there's another complication, I think, too, on the Iran side. I was just reading that one of their leaders, and his name escapes me, but just resigned because he
Oh
can't
yeah, yeah,
get
yeah.
agreement with the other power brokers in the government. So that's another complication is really who are you negotiating with? And you might be negotiating with one party, but they don't represent, well, as we were talking about who's at the table. Even on the Iranian side, there's
Well, even on
issues
the
with,
American side, you Trump isn't he's not in the room.
yeah,
And
right.
now he's talking about it's a good deal, but it's not a perfect deal yet. So
Yeah.
so whatever they bring back to Trump and say, here is the deal, Trump is still going to say, yeah, we need a little more. Yeah, we need to change that word. But yeah, because he can't help himself. The scorpion and the frog, right? He
I think that's right. And again, we're back to this question of, when you're negotiating, if you're negotiating with parties that don't have clear objectives, like, you can it can go on and on. And you could argue that maybe that's part of the strategy, but I think the Iranians are built for that kind of strategy. I don't think the United States is. I think the pressure, look, there's no question there's pressure on the Iranians from an economic point of view, but I actually think it's outweighed by the pressure that the United States is feeling because the global economy, you know,
and election.
put aside the stock market for a moment, okay? Because that's what everybody will point to and say, well, the global economy is being badly damaged by all of this. And, when you listen to people say, oh, once the Strait of Hormuz is open and the oil starts flowing, it takes a while. Like it really does. Like, the tap
Yeah,
is not
because
going
the
to turn
right.
on.
They had to turn it
And
off. Well, they can't turn it off because of the water pressure in the fields, and apparently all the gasoline is all full. So there's no place to put the
but there's a
production.
Right, but there's a whole supply chain. Like I listened to an oil expert um, talking about this, and he said, even if you were to um, find a solution, it's going to take at least 1 to 2, maybe 3 months to get a global economy back functioning in the way that it was. And so, and if we're just thinking about the interests of the parties involved, that pushes awfully close up to the midterms, right? So there's pressure um, internally in the United States to find a solution, at least probably from Trump's point of view, um, so that by the time those come rolling around, gas prices are down considerably, but it would have to happen pretty soon.
I'll tell you, we just in the past, since I got back, so beginning of May till end of May, when we got back from Spain in May, they were over $5 a gallon here in Colorado, and it is now down to under 4 in some places. So we've seen a massive swing here in 30 days at the pump, but it's still not 250.
No, and I think part of that as well, if my understanding is that the United States has increased its output to try to lower prices
Okay.
because it's not coming from anywhere else, right? And
Right.
so there's a way of trying to manage it in that way, you know. But again, let's imagine that you come up with a temporary solution to the Strait of Hormuz, right? Well, who knows how long that's going to last? Who
Right.
knows what that looks like? And you still have not addressed the nuclear issue, which is what purportedly this was all about.
Reportedly. There has to be some component of that. There's got the words on the page. See, here's the thing. No matter what you negotiate and what in the words you choose and everybody agrees to it, countries still go back and they do their own thing. So they don't even there is no compliance like we're going to send an auditor in. Yeah, we can send them in, but they bury it underground over here and they put it in this cave over there and then they have AI create fake videos because if they could do it for weapons of mass destruction back in the Gulf War, then they can do it today.
I
So
mean,
so there's really no agreement.
there are ways of verifying. They're not perfect, right? The IAEA is the nuclear watchdog that does that, and I think they had some success under the JCPOA, but I think that there was still stuff that was happening, right? It's a question of, are people really? It's what, as you say, you can agree to it on paper. Are they really committing to the implementation or not? And
Right.
and that is the challenge, and that will continue to be the challenge, and especially when there's active distrust. They might say, sure, we'll agree to that. And then as you go down that road, you realize, oh, well, the way we were treated, we don't really feel like living up to what we did and
We
vice versa.
rationalize our
Yeah, of
our
course.
our
Yeah.
behavior. Yeah. Well, and
Yeah.
I will, that makes it sound like I'm saying it's a bad thing. I think there's very rational reasons why if I'm a young Iranian that I really don't like America.
Sure. I mean, listen, the reality is, right? I mean, the world is not a black and white place, and people have different perspectives. And I remember when I started traveling in the late 90s, people absolutely adored the United States and saw it as a beacon and
Yeah.
a shining light on the hill that they wanted to aspire to. And now it's like there's very few people who want to aspire to what we are now,
Hey,
which
I went to
is
Italy
tragic.
as a 26, 27-year-old engineer, and I was the belle of the ball with the Italian engineers. And oh, they
Yeah.
tell us about life in America. I know there was excitement. I remember that, and now it's like, yeah, the Americans are here. Never mind.
Yeah. And so I think that is a problem for sure.
Right, right.
Hey guys, real quick, because I know Joshua, you're on the clock, and just a quick comment about the Beijing summit. Kind of interesting that China agreed to go along with the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. I know we don't have time probably to develop that, but I found that to be kind of an interesting outcome of that summit. But if any of you had a comment on that quickly, that'd be interesting.
I'm sorry, guys, I do have to go, but maybe we can
Okay.
pick that up next time.
Let's end it there, and we'll pick it up next time.
Okay.
All
All
right.
right.
All right,
Great.
gentlemen.
All right,
Josh, thank
Thanks,
guys.
you.
guys. Bye.
Gerry,
All
thank you.
right. Bye
All right,
now.
bye.